Hey everyone, I'm Justin. Welcome to my channel, Justin Hits the Trail. Today, we're talking about tents. So we are not talking all types of shelters here. We're only talking about tents, specifically different tent styles, being non-freestanding or trekking pole tents, semi-freestanding tents, and fully freestanding tents. I'm going to go over some of the features of each of these tent styles that make them unique, some of the pros and cons of each, which one might be best for you, and if I had to pick one tent style, which one would it be? So stick around and we'll dive in. Maybe you're looking to upgrade your current tent, buy your first backpacking tent, or you just like backpacking tents. Then hopefully this video can help you decide which one is right for you. I have 3 different tents set up outside. I'm not going to be reviewing each of these tents. There's not going to be any specs or details about these tents in particular. This is going to be more in general about these tent styles. There's always going to be an exception to the rule, so keep that in mind. Full disclosure, the Gossamer Gear tent out there, the one, I won that on a podcast competition. So if you want to hear something real dumb, go listen to episode 104 of Backpacker Radio, and it's about 1 hour and 38 minutes in. That will be a factor later in the video. You'll see what I'm talking about. Well, enough rambling. Let's start talking about the tents. The first tent we're going to look at is a non-freestanding or trekking pole tent. The one that you see here is the Gossamer Gear the One. These tents are usually single-walled. They must be set up using your trekking poles, and they have to be staked out because all of it is based off of tension. So, what are some of the pros of this style of tent? Well, first off, they're going to be the lightest that you can find, particularly if you get a DCF or a Dyneema fabric tent. Those are going to be the lightest of the light. Most of these tents will be less than 2 pounds, even for a 2-person, and you can even find some that are less than 1 pound. They also pack really small, especially the Sil Nylon ones. The Dyneema tents will be a little bit bulkier, but still will pack down nice and tight. These tents will also perform really well in bad weather, particularly wind. There's usually a lot of tension between the stakes in the ground and your trekking poles, and it actually makes for a pretty sturdy structure, even without that dedicated pole structure. Sil Nylon tents will absorb some moisture over time, so DCF will perform better in the rain, but overall, trekking pole tents actually handle bad weather pretty well. These tents also set up fly first because that's really all it is one giant rain fly with some bug netting and a bathtub floor. So if you're pitching your tent in the rain, the inside is going to stay dry. So what are some of the cons of this style of tent? Well, the big one is condensation. That condensation could be coming from humidity in the air, could be coming from your breath. If it's raining outside, some of that moisture might absorb in. So condensation is probably the biggest con. Dyneema tents will handle condensation a little better than the Sil Nylon tents because they're not going to absorb as much of that moisture, but it's still going to be a problem. The ventilation in this style of tent is just not that great. It is recommended that you open the doors if possible and let as much air in there as you can. These tents also usually have some sort of A-frame construction, and with that condensation and the lower angle of your tent walls, it's pretty common that you might hit your foot or your head on the wall of the tent and transfer some of that condensation onto your quilt or sleeping bag or onto your head. So that's something to keep in mind. Another con is they're a little bit trickier to pitch, especially well. There's a little bit of a learning curve to it. I have gotten more efficient with it. It's not too big of a deal anymore to set this up, but I'm a little anal about it and I want to make sure everything is staked out perfectly. I'm going to stake out the head and the foot so I get a little extra room there. but overall, they're a little trickier to set up than a semi-freestanding or a fully freestanding tent. They also take more space to pitch. The footprint of the tent body itself might not be that big, but because of how far you have to stake out the tent, it actually takes up quite a bit of room. When I was on the JMT this past summer, I was using the Gossamer Gear 1, my buddy had his Nemo Hornet, and he was able to fit his tent in a lot smaller spaces than I was. And speaking of pitching your tent, well, that's really awkward. Speaking of setting up the tent, you're not going to be able to set it up everywhere. If you're somewhere really rocky, or if you're just camping, let's say, out on some granite somewhere, these are going to be a pain in the ass unless you have some nice rocks sitting nearby that you can use to tension everything out with. So they're best if you have some nice flat ground that you can easily drive stakes into. Another con is they require you to have, well, trekking poles. Now, usually the manufacturer will have an aftermarket pole that you can buy if you don't use trekking poles, but I feel like the purpose of a trekking pole tent is to use what you already have instead of bringing along a dedicated pole set, so take that for what it's worth. Some models of trekking pole tents only require one pole to set up, a lot require two, but if you don't hike with any trekking poles, then this might not be the right style for you. Another con, and this is not applicable to all trekking pole tents, but certain brands do not come seam sealed. They'll offer a seam sealing service for an extra charge, or you can do it on your own. I don't like this. I feel like if you're going to offer a good product, it should come waterproof already. That's one feature I don't like about some companies, but these tents are also only good for 1 or 2 people. And if you do have 2 people using the tent, it might be a better idea to get a 3-person version. Let's move on to semi-freestanding tents. These tents do have a dedicated pole structure. They usually set up with 2 poles at the head end and then 1 pole that goes across the center of the tent down to the foot. So what are some of the pros of this style of tent? 1, they're still ultralight. They may not be quite as light as the trekking pole tents, but they're still lightweight, usually between 2–2.5 pounds, and you can split that weight up if you have multiple people to make it easier on yourselves. They're also pretty easy to pitch, easier than trekking pole tents anyway. They do have that dedicated pole structure, but you do need to stake out the foot end. These tents also still pack down nice and small, and if you carry the poles separate from the body and the rainfly, usually you can smash that tent fabric enough that it's actually about the size of a trekking pole tent. These tents are also double walled, so they provide more ventilation than the trekking pole tents. They have the main tent body, which is usually mostly mesh with the bathtub floor, and then you have the separate rainfly that goes over that. This double wall setup makes for good ventilation. It keeps the moisture that may be on the rainfly away from you, so you have less chance of getting wet inside the tent. Another benefit of having the separate rainfly is if it's nice outside and you want to stargaze, you can just take it off. Then you just lie there on your sleeping pad looking up into the sky. You can't do that with a trekking pole tent. What are some cons for these semi-freestanding tents? 1, these are probably going to be the worst in the wind. With that one center pole going across, it bends pretty easily. I've been in some pretty gnarly wind in this tent, and although it's held up, it's definitely been flopping back and forth quite a bit. And even though it's lightweight, it's still heavier than most of your non-freestanding tents. It's also bulkier. Not as bulky as a fully freestanding tent, but more so than your non-freestanding tents. And even though you can compress the fabric quite a bit between the tent body, rainfly, poles, stakes, it's still a little more substantial than a non-freestanding tent. Another con is the fact that, well, you still have to stake out the foot end. It's not fully freestanding. So if you are camping on rocks, there's a much better chance you could just, stake it out using 2 rocks. It's not going to be that big of a deal. It's not like you have a whole bunch of tension that's required to set up the structure of the tent. It's not like that, but it's not quite as practical in this sense as a fully freestanding tent. Let's move on to fully freestanding tents. This is going to be your most common style of tent that you're going to see out there. These tents have a dedicated pole structure that usually go from corner to corner, but there are several variations. They're not all going to be identical. These tents are fully freestanding, which means you don't need stakes for this tent. It's going to stand on its own without the aid of any sort of tension, like with the other styles of tents. So what are some benefits of a fully freestanding tent? Well, for one, it's probably the easiest style of tent to pitch. Just set up the poles, attach the tent body, stake down, and put the rainfly on, and you're done. These tents are also good in bad weather, particularly in the rain. They might not handle wind as well as a trekking pole tent, but it's going to handle rain the best, and it's going to handle wind better than a semi-freestanding tent. Because these tents are fully freestanding and you don't need stakes to set them up, you can set up on rock with these tents. You can also pick up the tent and move it if you decide you don't like campsite selection, or maybe you pitched it facing the wrong direction. It's easy to just pick the tent up and set it down where you want it. And just like the semi-freestanding tent, it has the separate rainfly, so it's got good ventilation. You can take the rainfly off if you have nice weather and you want to stargaze, and these tents will handle condensation pretty well. Another benefit of this style of tent that I think a lot of people overlook is they're really easy to clean. You can just pick it up, shake out the dirt, and you're good to go. And you cannot do that with a non-freestanding or a semi-freestanding tent. But two cons of this style of tent. They're going to be the heaviest and the bulkiest. Now you can get some really high-end models that are still really lightweight and packed down nice and small, but in general, like I was saying in the beginning of this video, I'm going to speak more in generalities, they are going to be the biggest and the heaviest out of all three of these tent styles. So, which style of tent is right for you? If you're going for a long distance hike, or you're just trying to shave weight as much as you can, then a non-freestanding or trekking pole tent is probably going to be your best option. They're going to be the lightest, the smallest, a little harder to set up, but that's kind of the trade-off that you make. If you do a lot of backpacking, but you're not out there trying to crush miles, and you want something a little more efficient and practical to set up, then maybe go with a semi-freestanding tent. If you want something that's simple and easy to use, that you can set up anywhere, or if you don't want to fork out tons of money for an ultralight tent, then you're probably going to be looking at freestanding tents. This is the most common style of tent, and you can get these from 1 person all the way up to 10 person. So if you're going to be backpacking with multiple people that all plan on sharing the same tent, this is probably the best option for you. Quick side note, it's not a high-end tent, it's not the lightest tent, but if you're new to backpacking or you don't want to spend an arm and a leg on a tent, the Marmot Tungsten 1 person might actually be a pretty good tent to look into. I found this on sale for $120 too, so not too shabby. So, as promised, if I had to choose one tent style to use, which one would it be? Semi-freestanding. They're still lightweight, lighter than most freestanding tents. They're easy enough to set up. If I have to use rocks to stake out the foot, it's not too big of a deal to me. They still pack down small, especially when you separate the tent body and the poles. They have good ventilation. I can take the rainfly off for stargazing. Overall, I like the versatility and the weight and space of this style of tent. So I used that Gossamer Gear tent on the JMT this past summer, and it performed amazingly. It's a permanent part of my arsenal now. I'm going to use it on all multi-night trips probably from here on out. But the reason I brought up winning it earlier is because if I didn't, I would have just used my semi-freestanding Nemo Hornet on the JMT. I'd use it for all my trips right now, and I'd have no complaints. And that's why if I'm recommending one tent, at least for an average backpacker, I would go with a semi-freestanding tent. So that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it helped you out or make a decision. Please like and subscribe. I'll be doing some gear reviews here shortly and posting all my future trips. You can check out my JMT videos right here. So that's all for now. Until next time, I'll see you out on the trails. Cheers.